Yo, what's up? It's Violet. In this video we'll be talking about the tanks and my impressions as to how they feel to play in regards to their pacing and playstyle. This video won't be going in depth with things like job skills or rotations, rather we'll be talking about how the job feels to play at 80s so that you can make an informed decision on which one you might want to pick up. Also, if you haven't finished Shadowbringers yet, do be aware that some of the footage playing in the background will have spoilers. So the four tanks that we have are Paladin, Warrior, Dark Knight, and Gunbreaker. Now unlike my previous videos that I've done on Scholar and Caster, it's a bit harder to assign each of these jobs to a specific pace because three of them are very similar. I think it's fair to say that Gunbreaker is definitely the fastest one out of all of them as they have the most buttons to push, but when we compare Paladin, Warrior, and Dark Knight against each other, I think what might influence you to pick one over the other is actually the identity that the job is built around and what their kit is like, rather than the pace of the job itself. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a pacing difference between Paladin, Warrior, and Dark Knight, it's just that the difference between them doesn't change the way you play the job. It's not as important as it was with the healers or the casters. Gunbreaker is probably the best starting point because its pacing actually does slightly affect how you play the job, and it is noticeably different from the other three tanks. Now, a term you're going to hear a lot is burst phase. If you don't know what a burst phase is, it's basically a point in your rotation where a lot of your skills are coming off cooldown and you'll be using them in a pretty short amount of time. Gunbreaker's burst phases both happen more often and are also more technically complex, and that's exactly why the pacing is faster on the job. A big part of Gunbreaker is making sure that you can get your entire burst off, making sure that within the amount of time that your burst happens, you use all the skills that you need to use. Now, between these burst phases are sections where there's not a lot going on, you're just doing a pretty basic combo. But the catch is that the burst phases happen every 30 seconds, so they always feel like they're coming up. You're always getting ready for the next one. And so because of that, it never really feels like the job slows down. It feels like you're always going forward to the next burst, getting ready for the next one, trying to plan out and make sure you get as many GCDs in before you have to disengage from the boss. Riding tandem with this is how it feels like you can use Gunbreaker's defensive cooldowns pretty much back to back. While Gunbreaker's mitigation is pretty standard and nothing to write home about, it's still very good, just like the rest of the tanks, but having camouflage makes it feel like you can just keep on stringing together mitigation after mitigation. You could start with the Nebula to take the heaviest hits, and then use Aurora to get healing coming in to mitigate some of that smaller damage. Once Nebula's up, you could use Rampart. Once Rampart's up, you could use Camouflage. You have Heart of Light and Heart of Stone, which you could chain together to get good mitigation. You still have Arm's Length and Reprisal, and all of these are coming off cooldown pretty quickly, so it feels like you have a lot of mitigation at your hands that you can keep on using and using, even if it's not as god tier as things like TBN or Nescent Flash. Gunbreaker's strength and mitigation doesn't come from sheer raw percentage reduction, but rather more consistent damage reduction over a longer period of time. So if you liked going fast and pushing lots of buttons, if you like playing Summoner, Ninja, or Astrologian, then Gunbreaker's probably a good bet for you. And now to the other side of the speed spectrum, we have Warrior. Now, I did say that Paladin, Warrior, and Dark Knight are similar in terms of pacing, but I did not say that they were the same. Warrior stands comfortably as the slowest tank you could pick up, in my opinion. Now, Warrior is kind of like the Donkey Kong or the King DDD or the King K. Rool of Final Fantasy XIV, where their main focus is just big, chunky hits. Their burst phase revolves around a skill that gives you critical direct hit guarantee and lets you spam your most powerful move for 5 GCDs. I think that in and of itself is probably the most indicative part of what Warrior is all about. It's spamming Fell Cleave. In terms of their damage mitigation and defensive cooldowns though, they're more focused on the healing side of things and using that big damage to heal yourself by using Nescent Flash. Equilibrium's very good, but along with this they also have pretty strong regular damage mitigation for stuff like your tank busters, but the potential amount of health back you could recover as a warrior will still win out in terms of just sheer mitigation. Coming back to job playstyle though, it's rotationally rather simple. There's not a lot that you have to micromanage other than your damage buff, so you're not going to be overwhelmed with what buttons you have to push. You just have to make sure you're pushing the right buttons at the right time, making sure you have enough beast gauge, making sure your damage buff is always going. Pretty simple things like that, and your burst phases come around every 90 seconds, so they're not as fast. It's not like Gunbreaker where you're going to be having a burst phase every 30 seconds. Warrior might actually be a very good pick if you're new to tanking and you want to try it out, because the job will allow you to focus more on tanking rather than the rotation and damage aspect of the job. I do think that the cone AoE makes it a bit harder to pick up mobs, but I feel like you get used to it pretty quick. But beyond that, if you want a slower paced job or you just like the aesthetic of Warrior, then it might be worth considering. The next job we'll be talking about is Dark Knight, which seems like it plays very similarly to Warrior on paper because of the similarities between their simple rotations and their burst phases. But Dark Knight sets itself apart by having more OGCDs, 2 resource bars to manage between their job gauge and their mana bar, as well as having a different style of damage mitigation. Let's start with the pacing and playstyle of Dark Knight, which is going to be the fastest when compared to Paladin or Warrior. Even though Dark Knight might not have as many OGCDs or buttons to push as Gunbreaker, they have to push these buttons more consistently over the course of the fight, unlike Gunbreaker where they're all concentrated within their burst phases. So that means you have to be looking to see when they're coming off cooldown. On top of this, you'll also be managing 2 resource gauges, which you have to spend appropriately. Don't overspend or overcap on them, so that also adds to the micromanagement of the job, which also increases the technical complexity. So yes, while the rotation is relatively simple and the burst phase is very similar to Warriors, in which it's a button you push every 90 seconds and then you spam one button over and over, there is more to Dark Knight than just what's on the surface, especially when we start looking at their defensive cooldowns and mitigation skills, which will actually set them apart from all 3 of the other tanks. Now, Dark Knight's mitigation skills are serviceable, they're fine. They have a strong one, they have Rampart, Arm's Length of course, but where Dark Knight really comes to life is with the Blackest Night or TBN, which is what everybody raves about, and for good reason, because it is insanely good mitigation. Being able to get a shield equal to 25% of your max HP along with a 15-second cooldown makes it incredibly good. And even though it does cost mana, the trade-off is practically 0 if you use it properly, because if the shield is depleted in the duration that the skill is up, then you get to use Flood or Edge of Shadow for free. It has basically no downsides other than the initial 3000 mana cost. So TBN transforms Dark Knight's mitigation into one that is less about planning and more about spamming TBN until you run out of mana. Of course you want to use it a little more intelligently, but there are cases where you pretty much just spam TBN on cooldown, especially in the bigger dungeon pulls. Dark Knight, I think, is probably a good pick if you're wanting to transition to a faster paced tank, but Gunbreaker feels a bit too speedy for you, or you just don't like the aesthetic of Gunbreaker, then I think trying out Dark Knight, definitely a solid choice. Quick kill.
She's dead.
The beam still went off.
Oh, what a baby.
I literally got shot by a mega beam. How does that make me a baby? And now we have the final tank, which is Paladin. Paladin's rotation and playstyle differs from the other 3 in that it expects a lot of discipline out of you. The rotation is slower and relatively simple, but each of the skills have a specific spot that they're supposed to line up into, and making sure that you have as little downtime in that rotation as possible is important to playing Paladin efficiently. Paladin does have 2 distinct burst phases that line up back to back, but they're not as fast as Gunbreaker because you don't have as many buttons to be pushing, and they last a longer amount of time. Because of this, even though they are technically burst phases in which higher damage skills are used and more damage is going out, they just feel like phases in the rotation of Paladin, where you have your normal phase, you'll have fight or flight, and then you'll have your magic phase. The magic phase is also notable in Paladin in that it gives the job a ranged rotation, which is very valuable for keeping uptime and keeping your GCDs rolling, something that the other tanks don't have. Paladin's damage mitigation is pretty run-of-the-mill, with most skills just doing a flat % damage reduction. However, Clemency is notable to talk about because it does heal a massive amount, and it is a very useful tool for rage utility for helping people survive or getting through prog. Clemency's use can feel limited though due to its high mana cost, as well as the conflict of interest between your magic phase and the skill itself. So thanks to the slower pace and relatively simple rotation, I think that Paladin's actually a pretty solid choice to pick up if you're new to tanking, because the damage mitigation tools you have available to you are also really strong. However, if you're also looking for something more rotationally disciplined and challenging to play, I think that at a higher level, Paladin offers a lot. So that's my thoughts on the tanks. I hope that this video was helpful, or at the very least entertaining. If you're looking for more in-depth job info, I recommend just doing some searching or checking the Balance Discord, because there's tons of information out there. I might even do my own videos on a couple jobs here and there, but I still think it'd be redundant. At any rate, I hope that you have a great day and take it easy.